The warning signs appeared long before the public ever heard a word about secret flights or hidden negotiations. But in the Sahel, silence has a way of lasting until the damage can no longer be ignored. Late one night, as most homes in Ouagadougou prepared to settle into the quiet hours before dawn, an unusual movement was recorded on military radar. No national identifier, no diplomatic clearance, and no explanation. It was only one aircraft at first, then another, and then a pattern began to emerge that suggested something far more coordinated than an error in the system. For older viewers who remember the Cold War and the long shadow of covert operations around the world, this moment feels familiar. Small signals become warnings. Warnings become patterns. Patterns become threats. In the Sahel, that threat reached a point where Burkina Faso's leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, could no longer remain silent. The narrator describes a region already burdened by years of instability, a region where borders stretch across vast open land, and where foreign influence often enters quietly, not with soldiers, but with agreements made in the dark. Families in villages along the border had begun to whisper about unfamiliar vehicles moving at night. Traders traveling between Mali and Burkina Faso noticed checkpoints operated by people they could not identify, and mothers living near the northern corridors said they heard engines overhead at hours when no official aircraft was scheduled to fly. These small accounts formed the background to a moment that would soon become a political earthquake. As reports grew, Traoré stepped forward. His voice was firm, measured, carrying the weight of a soldier who has seen what hidden operations can do to a nation already fighting to stand on its own feet. He said the red line had been crossed. He said foreign hands were testing the Sahel again. And he said that Burkina Faso would not allow secret deals or shadow flights to decide the future of its people. For those listening across Africa and beyond, his message was more than a statement. It was a signal that something larger had begun to unfold. Now, the question facing the region is simple, yet unsettling. If these operations were not accidents, then who authorized them, and what purpose were they meant to serve? The first confirmed incident occurred shortly after midnight along a sparsely monitored stretch of airspace between northern Burkina Faso and Mali. Local villagers reported hearing an aircraft flying unusually low, followed by the faint glow of lights that did not match any known military or civilian pattern. At first, authorities treated it as a possible smuggling operation. The Sahel has long battled networks that use remote corridors to move goods, weapons, and people. But this time, the pattern did not fit the usual routes. The aircraft descended, hovered for a brief moment, and then redirected toward territory where neither Burkina Faso nor Mali had authorized operations. Days later, a second incident occurred. This time, radar captured the movement, and intelligence officers began piecing together what seemed impossible to dismiss. The narrator explains that these aircraft were not rogue smugglers or lost civilian planes. They were well-equipped, deliberately timed, and strategically positioned to avoid both local and international detection. Their silence was the loudest sign of their intention. Meanwhile, on the ground, reports began to surface about unmarked vehicles moving through nighttime corridors. A young herder near the border with Niger described how he saw 2 trucks pass without headlights, escorted by men who spoke neither local languages nor French. He recalled that the vehicles traveled with the precision of people who knew exactly where they were going, as if they were following instructions that had been rehearsed. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed foreign contractors were involved. Others suspected a coordinated attempt to insert armed groups or extract local assets. But the most unsettling reports involved meetings held far from public view. A civil servant in Uwahiguya recalled overhearing fragments of a conversation between regional intermediaries discussing negotiations that did not appear in any official record. The narrator emphasizes that the Sahel has endured decades of foreign involvement, but the scale of secrecy this time felt different. It felt as though decisions were being made for the region rather than with it. In Ouagadougou, the intelligence briefings reached Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He listened as officers presented radar images, field reports, and intercepted communications. None of it pointed to a simple explanation. All of it pointed to a coordinated operation designed to test the resilience and awareness of Sahelian states. Traoré later described this moment as the point where he realized the red line had not simply been approached, but crossed. In his words, Burkina Faso could not tolerate foreign actors treating its airspace and its sovereignty as negotiable. He stated that these silent operations were intended to probe weaknesses, sow confusion, and create pathways for larger interventions. His message was unambiguous. No foreign power had the right to operate in the Sahel without the knowledge and consent of the nations whose land and people were affected. As Traoré's assessment spread, regional leaders in Mali and Niger began sharing information about similar incidents. They reported seeing increased activity near contested zones, unusual communications from external agencies, and evidence that local groups were being courted with promises of protection or financial reward. The narrator explains that these revelations connected the dots. The secret flights were not isolated events. They were part of a chain of operations involving silent deals made outside the political channels of the Sahel. These deals aimed to manipulate alliances, influence political outcomes, and keep the region from fully stepping into its new sovereignty-driven identity. More details emerged as intelligence teams uncovered signs that certain external actors were attempting to negotiate with militia leaders to secure footholds in strategic areas. If successful, these moves could destabilize the security gains Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had been building through regional cooperation. One officer described it plainly. Someone wanted the Sahel back under old forms of control. These discoveries were what ultimately led Traoré to take a firm stand. He declared that Burkina Faso would no longer allow silent deals to undermine its future. He warned that foreign hands operating outside transparency would be treated as threats, not partners. And he insisted that the region had learned enough from history to recognize when influence was being imposed rather than offered. As the narrator concludes this part of the story, the picture becomes clear. Hidden flights, covert negotiations, and the quiet formation of new alliances were not signs of diplomacy. They were signs of intrusion. And they raised one critical question that the region could no longer avoid. If these operations were coordinated from beyond Sahel borders, then what larger plan was already unfolding behind the scenes? As the evidence of unauthorized flights and secret negotiations became undeniable, the Sahel moved from quiet concern to a state of heightened alert. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, military units reported unusual disturbances along borders that had recently seen improved security. Patrols that once traveled predictable routes now found themselves adjusting to avoid unfamiliar groups whose presence did not match any official deployment. In villages near the tri-border zone, elders spoke about strangers who arrived asking questions about terrain, local loyalties, and community leaders. These visitors claimed to be humanitarian workers or contractors, yet their interest lay in strategic passages rather than development needs. The narrator notes that these details created a sense of unease among families already accustomed to the difficulties of living in contested territory. One farmer near the border with Niger described hearing aircraft late at night, followed by distant ground movement. He said it reminded him of previous years, when foreign operations often preceded periods of instability. The tension grew heavier when intelligence officers in Mali reported intercepting communications pointing to external actors trying to rebuild influence networks dismantled after the recent changes in regional alliances. It was clear that someone was attempting to regain a foothold in the Sahel through covert channels. When these reports reached Captain Ibrahim Traoré, he responded not with hesitation, but with clarity. He stated publicly that foreign actors were once again testing the sovereignty of Sahelian states. His tone was calm, but the content left no room for misunderstanding. He said the region had learned from painful history that intrusion rarely arrives with flags or uniforms. It arrives silently, through operations disguised as support, and through agreements made far from the eyes of the people who must live with the consequences. As Traoré's words spread across the region, reactions intensified. In Mali and Niger, leaders expressed solidarity, noting that they too had observed unusual activity that suggested a coordinated effort to challenge their autonomy. They condemned the use of covert flights and unauthorized negotiations, and warned that any attempt to manipulate local politics through external pressure would fail. The narrator explains that this unity among Sahelian states marked a significant moment. For the first time in years, the region was responding collectively, rather than independently, to threats that affected them all. Meanwhile, outside Africa, reactions were far more complex. European capitals released statements emphasizing the need for stability and transparency, but diplomatic insiders admitted that some governments were concerned that the Sahel was becoming more assertive than expected. Reports surfaced of emergency meetings within international organizations where strategists debated how to interpret the sudden emergence of covert activity in a region that had recently turned away from old partnerships. In Washington, analysts voiced concern that the unfolding situation could interfere with broader counterterrorism plans. They noted that if the Sahel viewed external actions as hostile, cooperation would become more difficult. Yet others recognized that the Sahel's frustration was rooted in years of feeling overmanaged and underheard. At the community level, fear and defiance existed side by side. In Ouagadougou, families discussed the news over evening meals, unsure whether the region stood on the edge of new instability or a new era of collective resistance. Younger citizens expressed pride that their leaders were refusing to accept silent interference. Older citizens recalled times when foreign operations had shaped the region without accountability. They said they no longer wished to see their children live through similar cycles. As tensions rose, Traoré addressed the nation again. He explained that foreign powers were attempting to re-establish the same patterns that once kept the Sahel dependent. He argued that the secret flights and silent deals were strategies meant to weaken internal cohesion and create confusion. Then he made a declaration that resonated across the continent. He said that Burkina Faso would not allow the future of its people to be negotiated in rooms they were not allowed to enter. The narrator concludes that this was the moment the situation reached its peak. Regional leaders were aligned. Communities were alert. External actors were unsettled. The red line had not only been crossed but acknowledged openly by those who were determined to defend it. And now a new and even more unsettling question emerged. If these covert operations were only the beginning, what consequences would unfold across the Sahel as the truth came fully into view? As the evidence of covert activity spread through the region, the impact began to ripple far beyond government offices and military headquarters. Ordinary citizens who had lived through years of insecurity felt a familiar tension returning to their daily lives. In the markets of Ouagadougou, merchants whispered about the possibility of renewed conflict, worrying that foreign interference often preceded the arrival of new armed groups. A schoolteacher in Kaya described how parents began pulling their children home earlier than usual, not because danger was present, but because the air carried a sense of uncertainty they had learned to trust. These reactions revealed a deeper truth about the Sahel. The people had become expert readers of geopolitical shifts. They had learned that secret operations, even when invisible at first, eventually reach the homes of farmers, traders, and families who want nothing but peace. The narrator explains that this is why the discovery of silent deals struck such an emotional chord across the region. People no longer believed foreign actors intervened to help. They believed interference came to shape outcomes without listening to those living on the ground. Meanwhile, local leaders began noticing unusual changes within their own administrative circles. Officials in border towns reported receiving unsolicited offers of logistical support from organizations whose involvement had previously been minimal. Some community chiefs described receiving visits from intermediaries carrying proposals that seemed beneficial on the surface, yet asked for information or access that raised concern. What alarmed many was how these proposals aligned with the timing of the secret flights. In Bamako, a retired officer commented to reporters that the pattern was too familiar. He recalled past years when foreign actors had used discreet meetings to form alliances with groups positioned to destabilize the region. He said the current developments bore the same marks, but felt more coordinated. As the tension grew, the Sahelian governments responded by strengthening security along borders and increasing surveillance of strategic corridors. This heightened vigilance brought clarity to situations that previously might have gone unnoticed. Patrols reported discovering newly established camps in remote areas, camps equipped with supplies that did not come from local sources. These findings made it clear that whoever orchestrated the silent operations intended to create a foothold in the region. For citizens, the consequences became tangible when supply chains slowed. Transport vehicles faced additional inspections, and some communities saw temporary shortages of essential goods. The narrator notes that these disruptions were not caused by instability, but by preventive measures taken by governments determined to protect their sovereignty. Yet the psychological weight on populations was undeniable. Families who had regained a sense of normalcy after years of turmoil feared that the region might once again be dragged into conflict. In response to these concerns, Traoré addressed the nation with a tone that blended empathy with determination. He acknowledged the fear people felt and assured them that the Sahelian governments were acting not out of panic, but out of responsibility. He explained that the red line had been crossed precisely because foreign actors had underestimated the unity of the region. He said that the Sahel would not return to a time when outsiders dictated the terms of its security. His words resonated with many who remembered how past interventions had ignored the will of local populations. Students at the University of Ouagadougou organized discussions on the meaning of sovereignty, linking the current situation to broader movements transforming Africa. They argued that the Sahel was entering a new political era where transparency and independence must replace hidden deals and covert agreements. Meanwhile, regional alliances strengthened. Coordination between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger became more structured, with shared intelligence and joint patrols reinforcing a message of collective resistance. The narrator highlights that these developments marked a historic shift. For the first time in decades, the Sahel was not reacting separately to foreign pressure. It was responding as one. Yet beneath the growing unity lay a deeper concern. Every time foreign actors interfered in the Sahel, the consequences spread across the entire region. New migration routes emerged. Communities became displaced. Extremist groups found opportunities to exploit weakened political structures. As people reflected on these past patterns, a question returned with renewed urgency. If foreign operations were already reshaping the region, how far would the consequences reach before the full truth emerged? When news of unauthorized flights and hidden negotiations began circulating beyond the borders of the Sahel, major world powers reacted with a mixture of concern, strategic calculation, and quiet urgency. In Washington, analysts who closely monitor African security reported to senior officials that the region was entering a new phase of resistance to external involvement. They warned that the Sahel's growing unity under leaders like Traoré could reduce American influence in counterterrorism partnerships that had been central to U.S. policy for years. Internal memos described the current situation as a moment when local governments were no longer willing to accept operations that bypassed their authority. Privately, some American officials acknowledged that the United States had underestimated how deeply sovereignty movements had reshaped political thinking in the Sahel. The narrator explains that Europe faced an even more complicated challenge. Countries such as France, which long treated the Sahel as a zone of strategic interest, viewed the discovery of secret operations as both a crisis and a warning. European diplomats expressed concern that if the Sahel believed foreign powers were involved in shadow activities, trust in regional cooperation would erode even further. For European institutions that had invested heavily in development programs and security initiatives, the shift in tone threatened to undermine years of effort. Meanwhile, in Brussels and Paris, emergency discussions focused on how to respond without appearing to confirm accusations of interference. International observers noted that global organizations were cautious in their public statements. They emphasized transparency and regional stability, But behind closed doors, they debated how a more assertive Sahel might reshape Africa's geopolitical landscape. If the region rejected silent deals outright, it could set a precedent for other parts of Africa to demand greater autonomy from long-standing partnerships. In the Middle East, governments watched the unfolding events with interest, recognizing that changes in the Sahel could influence migration patterns, security alliances, and competition for influence across North Africa. Russia and China viewed the moment as evidence that Africa was shifting away from Western frameworks for managing regional crises. They interpreted the Sahel's response to covert activity as a sign that new strategic alignments might be forming. Across the world, one question quietly emerged. If the Sahel had identified these operations as unacceptable, what would come next as the region asserted its position more forcefully? And how would global powers adapt to a part of Africa that now said no more? As the Sahel confronts the reality of secret flights and silent deals, the region stands at a turning point that will shape its future for generations. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's declaration that the red line has been crossed was not simply a reaction to isolated incidents. It was a reminder that the Sahel has suffered through years of decisions made far from its borders, decisions that brought instability, division, and a sense of powerlessness to communities that longed for stability. The narrator reflects on how deeply these patterns have marked the region. Families who endured conflict now recognize the early signs of intrusion. Leaders who once relied on foreign partnerships now question whether those relationships protected their people or exposed them to new vulnerabilities. And younger citizens, increasingly aware of global politics, see the Sahel's response as a moment of dignity after years of being told that sovereignty was unrealistic. Traoré captured this sentiment when he said that no nation should allow its future to be negotiated in silence. His words carried the weight of a soldier who has walked through the consequences of instability and who refuses to allow history to repeat itself. He warned that foreign hands operating without transparency do not come to support. They come to influence, and influence without consent is simply another form of control. As the region strengthens patrols, coordinates intelligence, and reinforces alliances, an even larger question now rises. What will the Sahel become if it continues to stand together? Will this unity usher in a new era of African independence where decisions are made by those who live with the outcomes? Or will external powers escalate their efforts, unwilling to accept a region that no longer aligns with their expectations? For viewers following this story from across the world, especially those who remember decades of international intervention in distant regions, this moment may feel familiar. It carries echoes of times when nations were tested, not by open conflict, but by actions hidden in shadows. If this story has stirred reflection or a sense of concern for the people living through these events, let that feeling serve as a reminder that sovereignty is not an abstract idea. It is a responsibility carried by families, leaders, and communities who want nothing more than a peaceful future. As the Sahel prepares for what comes next, may clarity guide its decisions, may courage protect its borders, and may unity prevent the region from falling into old cycles. And for all of us watching from afar, may we remember that when a nation chooses to defend its own voice, it also reminds the world that silence is never the measure of strength.